To understand the weight of the warning delivered in August 1943, one must first understand the man who delivered it. Adolf Galland was not merely a senior officer. He was an embodiment of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, a living legend whose word carried the authority of hard-won experience and unparalleled success. By the summer of 1943, his credibility was not just established, it was nearly unassailable. Galland's reputation was forged in the crucible of combat. He had cut his teeth as a ground attack pilot in the Condor Legion during the Spanish Civil War, a brutal training ground that taught him the grim realities of aerial warfare. When the Second World War erupted, he transitioned to fighters and quickly ascended into the ranks of the elite. His score mounted with a terrifying rapidity. The Western Front, the Battle of Britain, Galland was there, a predator in the skies. His Messerschmitt Bf-109, an extension of his own will. The kill markings on his aircraft tail were not just notches on a stick. They were a testament to his skill, his instincts, and his understanding of aerial combat in its most visceral form. He was a master of the rote, the basic fighting unit of 2 aircraft, and the Schwarm, the 4-aircraft formation that gave German pilots a tactical edge. He didn't just fly. He thought, he adapted, he survived, and he prevailed. But Galland was more than just a skilled duelist. His credibility stemmed from a rare combination of frontline prowess and sharp analytical intellect. He was a pilot philosopher, a man who could dissect the mechanics of a dogfight with the same clarity he used to analyze broader strategic trends. He understood that air power was not merely about individual heroics, but about logistics, production, technology, and most importantly, the delicate morale of the men under his command. This dual identity, as both a celebrated ace and a thoughtful commander, set him apart. When Galland spoke about the capabilities of an enemy aircraft, he did so not from intelligence reports alone, but from the cockpit perspective, from having seen the strengths and weaknesses of Allied aircraft in the lethal dance of combat. His position in August 1943 cemented this authority. He was the General der Jagdflieger, the general of fighters. This was not a desk job in the purest sense. It was the nerve center of the entire German day fighter force. From this position, he was privy to the most sensitive intelligence. Decrypted Allied communications, technical evaluations of captured aircraft, and the grim, relentless statistics flowing in from every front. He saw the monthly production figures from German factories and compared them, with a sinking feeling, to the estimated output of American and British plants. He read the after-action reports from his pilots, the young men who were flying, fighting, and dying against an enemy whose strength seemed to grow exponentially with each passing week. Furthermore, Galland had earned a reputation for blunt honesty, even when it was politically inconvenient. He was no sycophant. He had clashed with the high command before, advocating for a focus on fighter production over bombers, understanding that the very survival of Germany was now dependent on defending its skies from the Allied bomber offensive, not on launching further speculative attacks. This history of speaking uncomfortable truths added a profound weight to his future warnings. When Galland raised an alarm, it was known that he did so not out of panic or defeatism, but from a cold, calculated assessment of the facts as he saw them from his unique and comprehensive vantage point. The men under his command trusted him because he was one of them, scaled to the highest level of command. The aces and the novice pilots alike knew that Galland had faced the Spitfire over the English Channel, that he had felt the shudder of his aircraft taking hits, that he understood the fatigue, the fear, and the exhilaration that defined their existence. This connection to the front-line experience was the bedrock of his moral authority. He was not a distant bureaucrat making decisions based on maps and abstractions. He was a warrior leader. Therefore, when intelligence began to filter in about new tactics, about American fighters appearing where they should not be, Galland's antennae were finely tuned. He listened to the worried debriefings of his pilots returning from intercepting bomber formations deep inside Germany. They spoke of a twin-boomed, sharp-nosed fighter, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning being, encountered with increasing frequency. Initially, it was a curiosity, then a concern, and finally a serious problem. The P-38 was different. It was rugged, heavily armed, and had two engines, giving it a resilience that single-engine aircraft lacked. But the most alarming reports were not about its dogfighting ability, they were about its range. Galland, the analyst, pieced these fragments together. He cross-referenced sightings, calculated fuel loads, and arrived at a disturbing, yet inescapable conclusion. The P-38s were not just straying further. They were being systematically equipped to escort the bomber streams for a significant portion of their journey into the heart of the Reich. This changed everything. The entire German defensive strategy, which had relied on attacking bomber formations once their short-ranged escorts had been forced to turn back, was suddenly and terrifyingly obsolete. By August 1943, Adolf Galland's credibility was at its peak. He was a combat legend, a strategic thinker, an honest broker, and a commander who commanded the respect of his men. He possessed all the data, all the experience, and all the authority to sound the alarm. He was, in every sense, the perfect messenger. The tragedy for the Luftwaffe was that he was about to deliver his most critical warning to a man who valued political loyalty and self-delusion more than hard, unwelcome truth. The stage was set for a confrontation that would hinge entirely on the perceived credibility of the messenger against the impregnable arrogance of the recipient. By the summer of 1943, the air war over Europe had transformed into a brutal, industrial-scale conflict of attrition. The skies of the Reich were no longer the domain of individual aces in chivalrous duels. They had become a factory floor for death, a vast mechanical ecosystem where the primary product was destruction. This was the era of the bomber stream, an unstoppable aerial armada that represented the material and philosophical might of the Allied powers unleashed in its most terrifying form. The concept was simple in theory, but apocalyptic in execution. Instead of small scattered formations, the British RAF Bomber Command, under Arthur Bomber Harris, and the American USAAF 8th Air Force, adopted the strategy of concentrating hundreds, and soon thousands, of heavy bombers into a single dense and relentless river of aircraft. This stream would flood the German air defense system, overwhelming it through sheer mass. For the German defenders, it was a tactical nightmare. The Kammhuber Line, a sophisticated network of radar-guided night fighters and flak batteries stretching from Denmark to France, was designed to engage individual bombers or small groups. The stream simply swamped it. The radar screens of the German Jagdgeschwader fighter wings would not show distinct blips, but a solid crawling smear of light, an electronic representation of an oncoming storm. The daytime brought the Americans with their Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses and consolidated B-24 Liberators. Flying in tight, mutually protective box formations, they aimed to prove the controversial doctrine of daylight precision bombing. The B-17, in particular, was a legend of ruggedness, a four-engine behemoth capable of absorbing phenomenal punishment and still returning home. Its 50-caliber Browning machine guns, protruding from chin, top, ball, and tail turrets, created a sphere of fire that German pilots dubbed the dead zone. Attacking a fortified box of B-17s was a statistical gamble. A pilot had to fly through a hailstorm of lead, knowing that a single, well-aimed burst could turn his aircraft into a fireball. The psychological toll was immense. German pilots spoke of the sheer, intimidating presence of these formations, the way the sunlight glinted off a seemingly endless procession of plexiglass and aluminum, the deep, thrumming roar of 1,000 engines that could be heard from the ground like distant thunder long before the bombs began to fall. The night belonged to the British, and their war was one of a different, more terrifying character. The RAF's Avro Lancaster, the workhorse of Bomber Command, carried payloads that dwarfed its American counterparts. Their strategy was not precision, but area bombing, the systematic destruction of entire cities, aimed at shattering German industrial capacity and, crucially, civilian morale. The night bomber stream was a ghostly, dark menace. It navigated by electronic aids and the Pathfinder Force, which marked targets with showers of colorful flares and incendiaries. Below, for the German populace, the war became a sensory horror. The wail of air raid sirens, the drone of unseen engines in the blackness above, the frantic search for shelter, and then the world-ending concussion of high-explosive bombs and the eerie wind-fanned glow of firestorms that could consume entire urban districts, sucking the oxygen from the air and boiling asphalt in the streets. For the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, the bomber stream presented an existential crisis. The defensive tactics of the past were obsolete. The classic Sturmbach battering ram attacks, where heavily armored Focke-Wulf FW-190s would assault the bombers from the rear, required breaking into the formidable boxes. Each interception became a bloodletting. Pilots were ordered up, day after day, night after night, in a desperate, grinding battle of attrition. They faced not only the gunners in the bombers, but also the ever-present threat of mechanical failure, weather, and the sheer physical and mental exhaustion of continuous combat. The term combat fatigue barely captured the reality. It was a state of perpetual terror, of watching friends and squadron mates vanish in flames, of landing with an aircraft riddled with holes, of knowing that the odds were slowly, inexorably turning against them. The bomber stream was more than a military formation. It was a physical manifestation of Allied economic power. German pilots, for all their skill and courage, were fighting against the output of the factories of Detroit, the oil fields of Texas, and the unassailable industrial might of the United States. For every German fighter shot down, 2 more seemed to take its place, but for every bomber lost, 10 more appeared the following week. The stream was relentless, impersonal, and infinite. It was a tide, and the Luftwaffe was a sand castle on the shore. This was the context in which the warning about the P-38 would be delivered. The German fighter force was already stretched to its breaking point, engaged in a daily, desperate struggle against this overwhelming force. Their one key advantage, The one factor that made their defensive strategy viable was the limited range of the Allied fighter escorts. The bombers were at their most vulnerable during the deep penetrations into German airspace after their protective fighters, the Spitfires, the early model Thunderbolts, had reached their fuel limits and were forced to turn for home. It was in this window, this gap, that the German fighters could pounce with relative impunity, inflicting devastating losses on the unescorted bombers. The entire fragile equilibrium of the air war, the last shred of defensive hope for the Luftwaffe, hinged on this single fragile fact. The bombers, for a critical period of their mission, would be alone. The revelation that this was no longer true was not just a tactical setback. It was a strategic catastrophe in the making. The unstoppable stream was about to become invulnerable. The initial encounters were fragmented, dismissed as anomalies, or the result of navigational error. In the debriefing rooms of Luftwaffe airfields across northern France and Germany, pilots would mention it almost as an afterthought, a curious detail in the grand, violent tapestry of a mission. They had seen it, a distinct, twin-boomed silhouette, hovering at the very edge of vision, far beyond the point where the short-ranged Spitfires and Thunderbolts should have been forced to retreat. It was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and in the summer of 1943, it evolved from a sporadic sighting into a persistent, nagging specter in the minds of German fighter pilots and commanders. This was the distant threat, a problem not yet fully understood, but whose potential implications were so grave they threatened to unravel the entire fabric of the Reich's aerial defense. To the German pilot, the P-38 was an unorthodox and formidable adversary. Its design was a radical departure from the sleek, single-engine fighters they were accustomed to. The twin booms, the central nacelle housing the pilot and armament, gave it a unique, almost insect-like profile that was instantly recognizable. This was not an aircraft that blended into the sea of Mustangs and Thunderbolts. It was an individual, a specialist. Its performance characteristics were equally distinctive. The counter-rotating propellers eliminated the vicious torque that plagued powerful single-engine aircraft, making it a stable and deadly gun platform, particularly in the diving attacks it favored. Its two Allison V1710 engines provided not only redundancy, a luxury German pilots did not have, but also a climb rate and high-altitude performance that could be disconcerting. Most alarmingly, it was heavily armed. A concentrated battery of 4 50-caliber machine guns and a single 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose, meant there was no convergence pattern for the bullets to worry about. When a P-38 fired, it delivered a devastating cone of fire directly ahead, a sledgehammer blow that could shred an aircraft in a single, well-aimed burst. But for General Adolf Galland, analyzing the stream of after-action reports on his desk, the P-38's dog-fighting prowess was a secondary concern. The detail that leaped from the pages, the datum point around which a terrifying new strategic picture was beginning to form, was the line on the map connecting the sightings to the bomber stream's known route. The dots were plotting a course deep into the Reich. The P-38s were not just appearing, they were escorting. The implications were revolutionary. The Allied High Command had solved, or was very close to solving, the problem of strategic fighter escort. This was the linchpin upon which the entire air battle had turned. The German defensive doctrine, refined through bitter experience, was predicated on a simple, brutal calculus. Wait for the Wehrmachts, the four-engine ones, to cross the channel and press on into the continent. They would let the initial wave of escorts with their limited internal fuel buzz and harry the periphery. The German fighters would be held back, vectored by ground control, conserving their fuel and energy. They would mass for the kill only when the intelligence and radar plots confirmed that the escorts had reached their point of no return. This was the moment of vulnerability, the window of opportunity. The Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts would then fall upon the bomber boxes like wolves on a herd separated from its shepherds. It was during this phase that the Luftwaffe inflicted its heaviest casualties, that aces added to their scores, and that the Allied bombing campaign, for all its destructive power, incurred a cost so high that its very continuation was sometimes questioned. The presence of the P-38 in this sacred window changed everything. It meant the gap was closing. The shepherds were now accompanying the herd all the way to the slaughterhouse and back. A pilot who had mentally prepared himself for the relative safety of attacking unescorted bombers now had to contend with a nimble, heavily armed interceptor diving out of the sun. The psychological impact was profound. The mission, already a nerve-shredding ordeal, now carried the added, gnawing anxiety that the enemy's reach was longer than their own. The sanctuary of deep airspace, the knowledge that one was fighting over home soil, was being violated. Galland, the consummate analyst, understood this was not merely a tactical innovation. It was a strategic paradigm shift. The P-38's range was a function of technology and logistics, the advent of external jettisonable fuel tanks. This was a simple thing, a piece of pressed metal, but its effect was as transformative as any new weapon. It meant that the immense productive capacity of the United States was not just building more bombers, but was now building the means to protect them all the way to their targets. The Luftwaffe, already straining under the weight of the bomber stream, now faced a war on two fronts, a brutal, close-range battle of attrition with the bomber boxes themselves, and a new, draining fighter-versus-fighter conflict with an escort that was no longer tired and low on fuel, but fresh, aggressive, and operating with the moral and tactical advantage of the attacker. The distant threat was no longer distant. It was imminent. The sightings became more frequent, the reports more urgent. The P-38 was no longer a ghost at the edge of the battle. It was in the thick of it, breaking up attacks, chasing German fighters away from the bombers, and claiming its own victims. For Galland, the pattern was clear, the evidence irrefutable. The foundation of Germany's aerial defense was cracking. He had to make the High Command understand. He had to convey the cold, hard mathematics of this new reality to a man who preferred grand, Wagnerian gestures to grim logistical calculations. The distant threat in the skies was about to meet its greatest obstacle, the impregnable wall of willful ignorance at the very top of the German Reich. The journey to Karinhal was more than a mere transit from one military headquarters to another. It was a passage into the heart of the Nazi regime's distorted reality. Located in the Schorfheide forest north of Berlin, Hermann Göring's sprawling estate was a monument to vanity, power, and a profound detachment from the war being waged in the skies above Germany. It was a place of grotesque opulence, where grand halls were filled with looted art, where hunting lodges resembled medieval castles, and where the Reichsmarshal held court, surrounded by sycophants and insulated from the grim truths that plagued his commanders. For Adolf Galland, stepping into this environment to deliver a warning of imminent strategic catastrophe was a task fraught with political and personal danger. He was not just briefing a superior, he was confronting a mythology. The setting itself was designed to intimidate and subordinate. Göring, in one of his meticulously tailored white uniforms, likely held the meeting in one of Karen Hall's grandiose rooms, surrounded by the trappings of his self-anointed status as the last Renaissance man. He was the hunter, the art collector, the patron, the heir designate to Hitler. He played the role of a feudal lord, and his military commanders were often treated as vassals, whose purpose was to deliver good news and affirm his preconceived notions. The atmosphere was thick with the expectation of loyalty, not dissent. For Göring, the Luftwaffe was his personal fiefdom, the instrument with which he had promised the Führer that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the Reich. Its failures were not merely military setbacks. They were personal insults, challenges to his prestige and his carefully constructed image. Galland, by contrast, represented the antithesis of this courtly culture. He arrived at Karen Hall not with the obsequious demeanor of a courtier, but with the grim data and front-line experience of a battlefield commander. He was a man from the world of oil-stained flight jackets, of somber debriefings in smoke-filled rooms, of the acrid smell of cordite and the chilling sight of empty chairs in the mess hall. The contrast between the two men could not have been more stark. Göring, the corpulent prince of the party, living in a fantasy of his own creation, and Galland, the lean, battle-hardened ace, bearing the weight of a collapsing front. The briefing would have followed a familiar, frustrating pattern. Galland, with a clinical precision, would have laid out the situation. He would have presented the maps with the plotted sightings of the P-38s. He would have cited the after-action reports from experienced and reliable Gruppenkommandeur and wing commanders, men whose credibility was beyond reproach. He would have explained the technical implications of the external fuel tanks, a simple innovation with devastating consequences. He would have articulated the new tactical reality. The bomber stream was no longer vulnerable during its deepest penetration. The gap was closed. The defensive strategy of holding fighters back for a massed assault was now tantamount to sending them into a trap, where they would be forced to fight a battle of attrition against both the bombers' defensive fire and fresh, high-altitude enemy fighters. He would have spelled out the inevitable conclusion. Without a radical shift in strategy, a desperate focus on the mass production of a new generation of interceptors, a withdrawal of fighter forces from other fronts to concentrate on Reich defense, and the immediate development of counter-tactics, the air war was lost. The 8th Air Force would be able to bomb any target in Germany with impunity by day, and the RAF would continue its work by night. The industrial heart of the nation would be systematically pounded into rubble, and the morale of the German people, already tested, would break. Then the moment arrived. Having laid out his meticulous case, Galland delivered his central warning. The American P-38 Lightning, with its long-range capabilities, was now providing effective escort for the bomber formations deep into German airspace. The threat was no longer theoretical, it was operational, and it was catastrophic. Göring's reaction was not one of thoughtful consideration or alarmed inquiry. It was one of pure, unadulterated denial, fueled by a toxic mixture of arrogance, pride, and a fundamental disconnect from the realities of modern air combat. He erupted to suggest that the Americans, whom he deeply underestimated, could produce a fighter with such performance was an affront. The idea that his beloved Luftwaffe, the symbol of his power, was now fundamentally outmatched by a foreign design was intolerable. His response was not an argument based on counter-evidence or strategic analysis. It was an emotional, almost hysterical rejection. "Impossible," he thundered. He dismissed the reports as the exaggerated fears of tired pilots, the cowardice of those who sought excuses for their failures. He scoffed at the P-38, perhaps deriding its unconventional twin-boom design, refusing to believe it could outperform German engineering. He accused his pilots, and by extension Galland himself, of seeing ghosts, of misidentifying aircraft, of incompetence. For Galland, this was the moment the chasm between the front and the high command became an unbridgeable abyss. He was not being heard. His credibility, built on 100 missions and 1,000 data points, was meaningless in the face of the Reichsmarshal's willful delusion. The meeting at Karen Hall was a profound failure of command. It was not a military briefing. It was a clash of two realities. In one, Galland's the Luftwaffe was bleeding to death, facing an existential threat that required immediate radical action. In the other, Göring's the Luftwaffe was still the invincible force of 1940, and any suggestion to the contrary was treasonous defeatism. The fateful briefing did not result in a change of strategy. It resulted only in the solidification of a fatal error. The door to reason was slammed shut, and the Luftwaffe was left to face the coming storm, with its commander-in-chief insisting, against all evidence, that the storm clouds did not exist. Hermann Göring's explosive dismissal of Adolf Galland's intelligence was not a momentary lapse in judgment or a simple outburst of temper. It was the inevitable product of a deep-seated, pathological arrogance that had festered for years, a character trait that had become the single greatest liability of the German Air Force. To understand why the Reichsmarschall would label a verifiable tactical fact as impossible is to dissect the very psyche of the man and the corrupt nature of the system he embodied. His arrogance was a multifaceted poison, blending personal vanity, political calculation, technological snobbery, and a profound detachment from the war his pilots were fighting. At its core, Göring's identity was inextricably linked to the Luftwaffe. He was not merely its commander, he was its creator, its political patron, and its public symbol. His personal prestige, his standing with Hitler, and his own self-image were invested in its success. To admit that the Luftwaffe was technologically and tactically outmatched by the Western Allies was to admit his own personal failure. For a man who reveled in titles, uniforms, and the trappings of power, this was an intolerable prospect. In the court of the Führer, where perceived strength was everything and weakness was ruthlessly exploited, such an admission would have been political suicide. His rivals, Himmler, Goebbels, Bormann, would have pounced on it. Therefore, bad news was not simply inconvenient. It was a direct threat to his position and his life. The easiest way to neutralize this threat was to deny its existence outright. By shouting down Galland, he was not just rejecting a report, he was defending his own crumbling legacy. This arrogance was compounded by a deeply ingrained contempt for his enemy's capabilities. Göring, like many in the Nazi high command, held a racially tinged belief in the inferiority of American industry and innovation. He saw the United States as a nation of crude materialists and money grubbers, incapable of the engineering finesse and martial spirit inherent in the German soul. The idea that American designers at Lockheed could produce a fighter as sophisticated and effective as the P-38 challenged this foundational prejudice. To him, it was aesthetically and intellectually impossible. German engineering, in his mind, was supreme. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-90 were the pinnacles of fighter design. Any foreign aircraft that purported to surpass them in a key metric like range must be the subject of exaggerated reports or outright lies. This technological snobbery blinded him to the simple, brutal logic of Allied production. They did not need to build the perfect fighter. They just needed to build a very good one in overwhelming numbers and equip it with a simple piece of technology, the drop tank that his own staff had foolishly neglected. Furthermore, Göring was a creature of the past, an ace from the Great War, whose concepts of aerial combat were frozen in 1918. He was the last of the flying circus, a man who still thought of air combat in terms of individual heroism and dueling knights. The war he was now fighting, however, was one of industrial production, radar interception, fuel capacity, and electronic warfare. It was a war of scientists and factory managers, not just of pilots. Göring had no patience for this unheroic side of the conflict. He wanted to hear about glorious dogfights and soaring kill ratios, not about the logistical nightmare of fuel shortages or the tactical implications of a fighter's ferry range. Galland's warning was mired in this complex, unglamorous reality. It was a problem of physics and logistics, not of courage. Göring's arrogance prevented him from engaging with a war that had evolved beyond his understanding. His lifestyle had also completely severed him from the realities faced by his men. While Galland and his pilots lived on front-line airfields, struggling with supply shortages and flying multiple sorties a day against terrifying odds, Göring was sequestered in the Baroque splendor of Karrenhall, engrossed in the acquisition of art treasures and the planning of lavish hunts. He was surrounded by yes-men and party functionaries who told him what he wanted to hear. The brutal honesty of a front-line commander like Galland was an alien disruptive force in this environment. Göring's court was an echo chamber of sycophancy, and Galland's voice was the sound of the outside world breaking in, a world of defeat, death, and failure. His arrogance was, in part, a defense mechanism against this intrusion. Ultimately, Göring's fatal arrogance was a refusal to be humbled by fact. It was the triumph of dogma over data, of pride over prudence. In that moment at Karrenhall, he was not weighing evidence. He was defending a fantasy. He chose to believe in the invincibility of his own creation and the inferiority of his enemy, because the alternative was too devastating to contemplate. He sacrificed the lives of his pilots and the defense of his country on the altar of his own ego. By declaring the P-38's long-range escort impossible, he did not make it so. He merely ensured that the Luftwaffe would be tragically, catastrophically unprepared for the undeniable reality that was already forming in the skies above. His arrogance was the final, critical component in a perfect storm of failure, a willful blindness that granted the Allies the one thing they needed most: time to perfect the noose that was already tightening around the neck of the Third Reich. The late summer and autumn of 1943 did not merely validate Adolf Galland's warning. They etched it into the burning sky of the Reich with the searing clarity of cannon fire and the twisted metal of fallen aircraft. Göring's declaration of impossible was proven not just wrong, but catastrophically so, in a series of brutal engagements that marked the irrevocable turning of the tide in the air war. The P-38 Lightning, once a distant threat, became the undeniable executioner of the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy, and its success paved the way for an even more formidable predator, cementing a point of no return from which Germany's aerial forces would never recover. The proof came in the form of escalating losses and failed interceptions. The USAAF's deep penetration raids, targeting the very industrial heart of Germany, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen, became the bloody proving grounds. On these missions, the bomber boxes, previously savaged in the unescorted Gap, now flew with a new confidence. Circling high above, the P-38s, nicknamed Der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil, by German pilots, patrolled with impunity. They did not need to tangle in turning duels with the more agile Bf-109s at low altitude. Their doctrine was one of slashing high-speed attacks from altitude. They would dive through the German fighter formations, using their concentrated nose armament to make quick, lethal passes on the attacking Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts, breaking up their carefully coordinated assaults before they could even begin. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical one. The German pilot, once the hunter stalking a vulnerable herd, now found himself the prey, constantly scanning the high sun for the distinctive twin-boom silhouette. The consequences of Göring's denial were quantified in stark, horrifying terms. The loss rates among the German fighter units spiked dramatically. It was not just the loss of aircraft, which German industry, under increasing bombardment itself, was finding harder to replace. It was the loss of the irreplaceable. The experienced formation leaders, the Rottenführer and Schwarmführer, the men who possessed the situational awareness and tactical skill to effectively lead others into the maelstrom. These veterans were being systematically culled. They were replaced by hastily trained boys, green pilots thrust into a cauldron for which they were utterly unprepared. Their life expectancy was measured in a handful of sorties. The qualitative edge of the Luftwaffe, once its greatest asset, was being ground into dust. The intricate, fluid tactics that had given them an edge early in the war broke down in the face of overwhelming numbers and the constant, harrying presence of the long-range escorts. Just as the Luftwaffe was reeling from the shock of the P-38's effectiveness, the second, more devastating blow fell. The P-38 had been the proof of concept, the aircraft that demonstrated the viability of the long-range escort mission. But its true, world-altering legacy was that it allowed the bombers to survive long enough for its successor to arrive. That successor was the North American P-51 Mustang. Mated with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the P-51 possessed not only the range to fly to Berlin and back, but also the performance, the speed, maneuverability, and high-altitude capability to defeat any piston-engine fighter in the world on equal terms. The P-38 had closed the gap. The P-51 tore it wide open and established absolute Allied air superiority. By early 1944, during the climatic battles for Big Week, the point of no return had been decisively crossed. The skies over Germany were now the hunting grounds of the Mustangs. The Luftwaffe was forced to fight a war on the Allies' terms. They could no longer choose the time and place of their interceptions. They were dragged into a war of attrition they could not win, losing pilots and aircraft at a rate that was simply unsustainable. The P-51s, flying in loose, sweeping formations, ranged far ahead of the bombers, engaging the German fighters as they assembled, as they climbed, as they attempted to attack. The initiative had been utterly and permanently seized by the Allies. The warning Galland delivered in August 1943 was the last clear chance to alter this course. Had Göring listened, had the Reich thrown its industrial and scientific might into a crash program for a next-generation high-altitude interceptor and the mass production of the Me-262 jet fighter as a pure interceptor, the outcome might have been different, or at least prolonged. But that moment was squandered. The denial at Currenhall guaranteed that when the crisis arrived, the Luftwaffe had no answer. The P-38 was the harbinger. The P-51 was the executioner. Together they secured the airspace necessary for the D-Day landings and the final destruction of the Third Reich. The fork-tailed devil had not just won battles. It had proven a principle, and in doing so, it unlocked the door for the Mustang to ensure that the Luftwaffe and the regime it served had passed the point of no return. The air war was lost not in the skies over Berlin in 1945, but in a luxurious hunting lodge in 1943, when a man who refused to believe the evidence was given his final, fateful warning.